guys, welcome to the next lesson in Unit 2. Today we're going to talk about communities and ecosystems. So building on all the information from species and populations, we're going to keep looking at how different organisms interact in environments when they're together. So first, a little review of some vocabulary. There are some words that you should be familiar with. These are some of the words that you can be using when you're writing about ecosystems and ecology. You should be able to define a species as a group of organisms that can interbreed, a population, like we saw the population of lions in the last video, as a group of the same species that are in the same place at the same time, a community as a group of populations living together and interacting in the same habitat, and an ecosystem as a community and the physical or abiotic environment that it interacts with. One place that I like to look at for an ecosystem is tide pools. This specific tide pool is in Sardinia, and you can see abiotic factors like water and rocks. You can't see as clearly some of the biotic stuff that lives in this tide pool, but there are populations of small fish and sea urchins that exist and hang on to all of these rocks. So when you look at an ecosystem, you should be able to describe it using succinct vocabulary. Also, when you look at an ecosystem, you should keep in mind that there are two processes that power everything that happens in any living environment. And those are cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So cellular respiration happens in all living things, including plants. That's a big misunderstanding about science, that plants only perform photosynthesis. They also perform respiration. And respiration is the conversion of organic matter into carbon dioxide and water, releasing energy. So we have energy stored in carbon-based molecules called glucose. When those glucose molecules combine with oxygen, they provide cellular energy and water and carbon dioxide as waste products. We get that glucose through photosynthesis, which is a process that happens in plants. They convert light energy into chemical energy and oxygen as a waste product. So plants take in carbon dioxide and water and break apart light energy in their chlorophyll in order to form glucose and oxygen as a waste product. If you've ever taken an introductory level biology class, you probably know that the reactants for one of these equations are the products for the other. So these exist in a cycle going around and around and around, and it's lucky for us they do, because it is what powers all life on Earth. So when we look at energy collected in an ecosystem, the energy starts once it's converted from solar to chemical energy. And that happens in a group of organisms that we call primary producers or autotrophs. And their job is, this prefix auto means self. The word troph means feeding level. So they are self-feeding. They convert sunlight to chemical energy and don't need to rely on any other source for food. Once these primary producers, these plants, have converted sun energy to chemical energy, that's great because it means that it's available for all of the consumers in a food chain or a food web. So these are all organisms that are called heterotrophs, or other feeding organisms, and they consume other living things in order to gain energy. We also, in any food chain or food web, have organisms that are decomposers and detrivores that break down and recycle dead matter, and that allows us to keep recycling the matter that's involved in a food web or a food chain over and over. We'll look at that a little bit more closely in the next section of the book. But for now, know that it is important to be familiar with some of this vocabulary. Autotroph and heterotroph are two words that it's great to be able to use in a succinct explanation or definition of a food web or a food chain. And let's look a little bit more closely at food webs and food chains. So food webs are basically just complicated food chains. Food chains only show one set of relationships. Food webs allow for a whole picture of relationships. But in both, you use arrows to represent the movement of energy from one organism to another. And in just a minute, we are going to try to make an example food web. And that's something you should feel comfortable doing, and it's not that hard of a thing to do. But the thing that I see get confused most often is the direction of this arrow. The arrow goes the same direction as the energy, from the food to the consumer. So before we try to build our own food web, let's think a little bit into how energy is passed along in these food webs and food chains. It's passed along by something called the rule of 10. And that means that only 10% of energy is passed from trophic level to trophic level as usable energy. Now remember, we studied back in Unit 1 this idea that energy doesn't disappear, it simply changes form. So the rest is lost as heat energy. 90% of the energy present at each trophic level of a food web or a food chain is lost as heat. This is important for us because it limits the amount of available energy, and it limits the length of a food chain to only 3 or 4 levels, because after that, you're out of energy. So with that in mind, let's take a look at trying to create our own food web. I'm going to read you a scenario, and you can pause this video and try to sketch out how you would represent a food web for this information. Off the coast of California is the unique ecosystem of a giant kelp forest. Minnows and zooplankton live in the kelp forest and feed off the kelp. Smallmouth bass and largemouth bass feed off the minnows. Seagulls are attracted to feed off the smallmouth bass. Sea urchins are also present in the system. Sea urchins are able to live off the kelp. Sea otters feed off sea urchins, largemouth bass, and kelp for a balanced diet. The whole system is kept in check by the sea otter population. And this is a real ecosystem that we actually come back and study a little bit more in Chapter 3 about biodiversity and conservation. But for now, let's just use it as an experiment to see how you guys feel about drawing food webs. So if you need to pause the video, do that now, because the next slide has a completed food web on it. All right, if you're ready to keep going, here is the food web for the information you were given for the giant kelp forest in California. We start down here with the kelp. You don't have to start at the bottom of the page, but it's easiest because it sort of helps keep all of your arrows and your boxes organized. The arrows go up to everything that feeds off of kelp. And remember, this is a model. So the arrows represent the movement of energy and the boxes represent storages of energy. All of these organisms are storing energy from food. We have some food chains that just end after the kelp. The zooplankton just seems to sort of end. There are fish present in this system that would eat zooplankton, but they weren't in our explanation, so we don't have to worry about them. But some of them keep going. So we have sea urchins getting eaten by sea otters. In our longest food chain, we have minnows getting eaten by largemouth bass, which are also getting eaten by sea otters. In a food chain, same length, but a slightly different end, we have minnows getting eaten by smallmouth bass, which then get eaten by seagulls. My arrows are terrible, but you get the idea. And if your food web looks like that, then you are in pretty good shape. So, in addition to talking about food webs, we also can represent the different trophic levels of an ecosystem in a pyramid shape, and we call those ecological pyramid models. There's 3 types of pyramids that you can draw. A pyramid of numbers gives just the raw number of organisms at each trophic level. A pyramid of biomass gives the weight or the mass of individuals at each level, so like the total weight of each level. And a pyramid of productivity shows the actual rate of flow of energy. These are the most accurate, but they're difficult to model because it's difficult to show energy flow in an organism. So the most popular kinds of models are really pyramid of biomass models, because it's easy to weigh things. It's more easy to weigh things than it is to try to talk about the conversion of sugar happening within organisms. These if they're drawn out, are usually theoretical. And this pyramid shape is important for us because it allows us to keep talking about those ideas of bioaccumulation and biomagnification that we introduced in the last section. So remember, bioaccumulation is the buildup of toxins in a body over time, and biomagnification is toxin concentration getting magnified as it goes up the food chain. So if these stop signs represent toxins, as you go up and up through the different levels of this ecological pyramid, they aren't going to go anywhere. They're just going to be concentrated in a smaller amount of mass. So the concentration of a chemical or a pesticide gets a lot greater, it gets a lot more concentrated as you get towards the top of an ecological pyramid. And that's important for us because it actually ties into your homework question. Your optional reading, if you're following along in the textbook, is pages 64 to 78 in the Oxford Press Environmental Systems and Societies book. And if you're not following along in the textbook, you should feel comfortable doing this writing practice exercise. Go back to the food web picture for the giant kelp forest and discuss 2 ways in which the addition of a persistent organic pollutant could affect other species present in the ecosystem. Take a minute to try to work that out on your own. It's worth 4 points, so remember you should have 4 points of information. When you're ready, you can check your work in the lesson review, and I will see you there.